Now, during September, the winning bids for 5 new power generation plants were announced in Nigeria, continuing reform of the sector that began 2 years ago. The development of the sector is vital to the ongoing development of the Nigerian economy and is being eagerly watched by investors who looked to participate in or are looking to participate in Nigeria's economic trajectory. Keeping track of these developments is Renaissance Sub-Saharan fund that invests across the region. Sven Richter in studio with us now. Nigeria, still the hotspot.
Still a hotspot. We've been seeing a lot of people put money into Nigeria. We still think it's attractive, but we also think that some of the sectors may have run a little bit too far. You know, your previous guest, you were talking about some of the consumer stocks. They are quite expensive, but banks are still attractive if you're in the right banks, I think.
Sven, you mentioned off air that there's both interesting things happening with the top tier banks, which many investors might be familiar with, but there's also positive developments with the second tier banks in Nigeria. What's your take on what's going on there?
Well, I think that many of the second tier banks were just too cheap. I mean, we do think at longer term, the large banks are going to be the ones that power ahead, they're going to have the market share, and they're going to win at the end of the day. But there's also always a valuation aspect, you know, and if you have a sound bank, it's a second tier bank, but it's been well run, and it's trading a P of 3 times, then it obviously is too cheap. But, you know, what we must be concerned about, though, is that some of those banks that have put out good results now are maybe keeping something a little bit in the bag in a negative way for the fourth quarter. There's some provisioning we still want to see coming through. So we do have some concerns that some of the new investors to Nigeria have just bought willy-nilly without actually understanding what's going to happen there.
Just in terms of for the benefit of I guess myself and our viewers, whereabouts is Nigeria in the interest rate cycle at the moment, and what do you expect from interest rates going forward?
Well, I think in Nigeria, if anything, we'll probably see interest rates come down a little bit. There's some diversion as to which way it's going to go. But I think across Africa, we've seen that inflation, which was pushing up a little bit in the last couple of years, has mitigated a bit. So, you know, Kenya was actually very, it had pushed interest rates a lot and has come down. And I think Nigeria is on a similar trajectory, as is much of Africa, because inflation is not a big fear in most of these countries at the moment.
Staying with West Africa, Ghana is gathering a lot of attention at the moment, and particularly Accra being touted as a great place to do business. Is that your experience?
Yes, it is. I mean, Accra's developed tremendously over the past few years with new shopping centres, also more traffic, which is obviously a negative as well, but when you try to get around. But it really has developed, and we think it's fantastic. Our biggest challenge actually in Ghana is that people just don't want to sell the shares that they do own. So the liquidity is actually really dried up quite a bit because people are so keen to stay in those companies. You know, obviously the oil money is starting to flow in, the country's developing, pleasant place to live. So yeah, very exciting actually.
Just one of the other areas that's becoming very interesting is Zambia, and it's been mentioned from the word on the street that I get. There's quite a lot of development happening in Zambia, a lot of positive prospects for that country. What's your take on what's happening under the leadership of Michael Sata in that country?
Well, I think good things. You know, when he first came to power, there was this sort of, you know, everyone took a bit of a back step because obviously, you know, he'd come in new, people didn't really understand what he did, and some of the things he did in the first couple of weeks were maybe quite shocking to people. He banned all copper exports, okay, and so we went, well, you know, what's he going to do to the economy? But I think actually he really was making a lot of sense. He was getting quite firm, and he was saying to the guys, you know, if you're going to mine in our country, you need to respect the labor laws, okay, you can't disrespect them, and you need to make sure that the copper that you mine is transferred out the country at the correct price. Don't transfer it at some very cheap price to an offshore jurisdiction, sell it at a more expensive price, and don't pay any taxes in Zambia. Pay your correct taxes so we can get our money and we can develop our country. So I think he's done a good thing. I think and what's also interesting is that he came to power, and here you had an election, and despite what you often see sort of touted about Africa, that there's no elections and no elections that go well, here you're an incumbent president who gave up power willingly once he lost at the election box, and you had someone come in who had from an outside party take power and just move ahead like in any normal democratic country.
Let's touch on Nairobi and how the temperature is in that country, given that they've been through a tough environment, specifically with the financial crisis. They got hard hit.
They did.
And it's almost as though Kenya became inward looking. They closed ranks. Is that the reality? Has it changed? Are they embracing the African continent?
I think that yes, I mean they did have some effect from the financial crisis, and of course Kenya, not being a sort of producer of large amounts of oil or something, battled a bit with spending more money or importing goods than they were able to export for a period of time. So the economy did tighten up a bit, but it never went into recession. Remember, and I think that was true of Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. During the financial crisis, Sub-Saharan Africa escaped recession, which is very positive if you compare to many other countries in the world. But they did become a bit inward-looking. But inward-looking maybe in terms of regional rather than countrywide, because they still kept their focus on the region. And for us, that's what's important and interesting about Kenya, is you have these 120 million people that are the Kenyan market for us. There's only 40 million people in Kenya, but Kenya is the Uganda, the Rwanda, the southern Sudan, parts of Tanzania, etc. So yes, and I think they are really moving ahead.
Isn't Rwanda starting to pick up in stature as the turnaround story of the African continent?
Rwanda's like the sort of star or Switzerland of Africa, or whatever, however you want to term it. It's never going to be a huge story in terms of size. I mean, Rwanda is a small country and it's always going to remain a small country. But you had some politicians move in who've done a good job. In fact, good is not really a correct word to describe it. Actually, a phenomenal job, turned the country completely around, very pro-business. So it's a complete turnaround story and shows what you can do. But to be fair, it's always, when there's only a few million people, it's always easier to turn your country around when there's 40 million or 100 million people. So it takes longer when it's a bigger country, but it shows what can be done with actually very little resources.
Sven, one of the things that's been talked about very recently is obviously the discoveries of oil and gas off the east coast of Africa.
Yes.
And within the context of that, we've seen tempers flaring on the border between Kenya and Somalia. This energy independent continent that many people are referring to, is it all hype, or is there a real chance that this could really funnel industrialization on the eastern side of the continent?
I think there is a real chance that it will. Obviously, there's going to be, pieces of land that you might have thought were worthless before and now suddenly worth something. So you're trying to decide exactly where the boundary is. I think this is something that going to happen across the whole of Africa when you find something very interesting out of the ground, as it happens in the rest of the world as well, whether you have China and Taiwan debating as to exactly where their boundaries are. So there will be continued debate about that, and we just have to come to some sort of solution in terms of it. But is Africa finding resources? Yes. I mean, it's finding gas, which we didn't know existed. It's finding underground water we didn't know existed. And all of those things, because it's great having just the energy resources to put up a steel plant, but you also need the water resources as well. And of course, you need the human resources as well in terms of education. And all of those things are improving and we think are benefiting Africa.